I'm going to kick us off here today with, like David said, it's really about walking you through our journey of what we've identified around blockchain, what do we see as an evolving technology, what it can do for you, and how you should look at it. And again, this is all biased based on our perspective and the way that we've built out our own blockchain projects and products. So I'll start you off today with one of my 3 favorite slides. This is my first one. Nobody can read it fast enough. It's our lawyers telling you that everything I'm telling you today is going to be grandfathered at the end of the day, because blockchain does evolve incredibly rapidly. And earlier today I got a chance to be interviewed by one of the MBA students, and one of the things that he said, are you an expert in blockchain? I said, yeah, as much as I could be after the last article I read last night. It's an ever-evolving technology. It really moves into a new space of how open source technology is being developed. So kind of stay tuned, and we'll walk through the process. So as David graciously introduced TerraHub, we are focused on 3 fundamental aspects. We look at education, we look at consulting, and then we have created this concept of a corporate lab or a lab for experimenting, which gives you an opportunity to go in and quickly trial the application of blockchain, how it can apply for you, and what you can do with it. I was just mentioning actually earlier at the table today that one of the reasons why we even started with the Haskell School of Business and offering 2-day executive courses was because I walked into the dean's office, into Jim DeWald, and I said, Jim, I'm the new dean of Haskell School of Business, while I sit in his chair. And he looks at me and says, Dan, what does that really mean? So I said, listen, I changed my profile on LinkedIn. Everybody now knows, so therefore it must be true. And then we started talking about the applications of blockchain and why transparency, why trust really are a part of the way that you're doing business. So currently, TerraHub's evolved quite a bit over the last year of business, where we're now working with a number of universities from Canada and the US and colleges. We focus closely on demystifying blockchain, so we bring in a lot of extra resources, like guys that work for the NSA, and they'll walk you through cryptography from an NSA perspective and why blockchain has not been hacked as to other current beliefs and so on and so forth. When we take a look at our consulting practice and what we do, we've worked on a number of very exciting projects this year, and one of the ones that you'll get to see here in a second focuses across multiple platforms, but really in the procure-to-pay space has been really exciting to redefine how do you create a one-touch invoice through the process. We've worked closely with Peloton Technologies on augmenting their blockchain platform, or I should say their title chain platform with blockchain technology behind it. And the funnest one for me was this project called Virtual Humans through a company called iVirtual, where we're actually creating what's called a blockchain vault to enable the storage of DNA and DNA sequencing, so you can take it anywhere you want with you and go into the private healthcare space and so on and so forth. So as you can tell, even though we work closely in the energy space, and we do come from the energy space as founding team members, we also span into other industries because blockchain does not apply to just one area of operation. So as I mentioned, the reason why I wanted to bring this up at the beginning is because I wanted to kind of walk you through the idea of why did we apply blockchain specifically to Peloton Technologies, specifically to the land management system, and even more specifically to the title chain of custody. It's because we needed to understand the way in which we can say, as of this point in time, when the management consultant goes in and verifies that all of us have the documents that we need to allow for a transaction to happen, meaning I'm going to change operator rights in this case, you have now a new defined line drawn in the sand that says, from the moment we've all agreed on this transaction, and from the moment we've moved forward from this transaction, whenever we look back, we know that everybody agreed up to this point in time of what is real and what is the truth. So the idea behind it wasn't to displace the management consultants that come in and are the land title consultants, but it's to allow a new way of trust model to be built between multiple parties, between the existing buyers and sellers and the new buyers and sellers. So if you're interested to learn more about it, I'll be happy to show you guys a video of it. We actually removed it from today's presentation because we realized that if you're in the very far back, you wouldn't be able to see a video. So if you're interested in it, we'll show you later. So let's kind of dive into what is blockchain. And the way that we look at blockchain, we represent it as an online repository of who owns what and when. So if you now sit back and you think about your business and you think about the things that you do in your business, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably in the energy space, whether you're from the service provider side or you're the owner operator of assets, think about how many different areas you can apply blockchain in by just looking at the fundamentals of who owns what and when. Recently, we were in an oil and gas company and we sat down with the finance team because they saw us at a talk and they said, come on in and explain to the rest of my finance team where we can apply blockchain. And I said, well, I can't tell you where to apply blockchain in your company because fundamentally, I do not know what your challenges are in your company. I do not know what your mandates are for next year. But if I explain to you what this technology can do, you can sit back and say, hey, here's where I think I can actually add value to my company. So one of them was in check requisitioning process. So they weren't looking at blockchain as a way to open up discussion with third-party service providers or anything like that. They looked at themselves as an organization and said, within our company, we have multiple business units that need to be able to talk to each other. So we'll consider each one of those people as a different player in our process. So in this case, they chose check requisitioning. They got phished. Somebody hacked their emails. And by using, yes, artificial intelligence, they were able to reproduce the way somebody's writing an email. Well, interestingly enough, that email had the same kind of signature, the same closing remarks as that manager typically does when he or she sends out an email to somebody else. And they got phished with a simple process of saying, hey, can you drop off $500 worth of gift cards at the Petroleum Club after I'm done my meeting, which obviously they already knew when he's going for their meeting. And the admin did that. So he dropped off $500 of gift cards at the Petroleum Club, not realizing that they got actually phished. So for them, blockchain was an enabler that allowed them to say, hey, what if there was a process that said there's no way that I can go forward and move to the next step without everybody approving that this is what's been requested or this is where we want to move into our day-to-day operational requests. So for them, blockchain was an internal tool to help them manage the way that they communicate amongst themselves and create a very proprietary and auditable process amongst their own finance team. So that's what it really kind of came down to. So outside of the typical beliefs where blockchain always has to be with third parties that are external to your company, not necessarily true. You have to kind of find the right way where it applies to you and what the value proposition is to you as a company. But let's get into a little bit of the blockchain history and walk you through some of the things that we've identified and looked at. So blockchain is not really new. And it might look like it's new to us, but really, even if we go back to the early 80s and even the early 90s, blockchain has been around for a long time. The cryptography level, that's a military-grade cryptography, has been what's enabled blockchain today to get to where it needs to be. If we look at why blockchain hasn't really spun out in the 70s and the 80s is because it would have been way too expensive to transact that amount of data between multiple parties using that level of cryptography. For those of you that are aware of the different layers of the internet, which we as the regular population, we're only allowed to be on the top layer, not anywhere near layer 3, 4, and 5, you'll know that having that kind of cryptography level is required to ensure that certain messages do not fall prey to other people. So if we go back to the early 90s, you'll even see here back in 94, the concept of smart contracts was actually drafted up as a paper. And then if you go even back further into the 70s, you'll hear this definition of the Merkle tree. Well, the Merkle tree was actually created in the 70s. So blockchain itself has been an evolutionary technology that's been slowly creeping up and getting itself ready for prime time. And its prime time happened to be back in 2009. And in 2009, you heard of, well, you might have or might not have heard of Bitcoin coming up at that time. And if most of you think about what was really happening globally in 2009, two major downturns were really happening. You had one, the housing market collapse in the US, and then you saw the Greece collapse, the Greece banking collapse. What was really interesting about the Greece banking collapse that allowed Bitcoin to become incredibly revolutionary in Europe and even make headway and become something of possible use is the fact that imagine walking today into TD Canada Trust or into RBC or whoever you bank with and them telling you, sorry, you can't actually draw out any money from your own bank account, whether it's your personal checking or savings account, because we need to pay some debt that we have owing to somebody else. Imagine how you would feel about that. So blockchain and Bitcoin, and I'll make the correlation here in a second, really started taking off and creating this new value proposition for the disintermediation of banking industry back in 2009, and it started growing ever since. Obviously, fun enough, the banks say, well, there's no way you're going to disintermediate me. I'm going to come out and I'm going to build my own blockchain platform so I can disrupt you out there in whatever you want to do. So you're not really taking me out of market anytime soon. But they saw the value proposition of blockchain and where it can be applied and how it can be applied. And they realized very quickly why they can be disintermediated if they don't do something about it. But I said I was going to make the correlation of Bitcoin and blockchain. How many of you ever downloaded a pizza app from your app store? Okay, or you've used an app store app, right? Well, so is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is really an app built on top of the blockchain platform. Blockchain platform itself is a technology platform that, if most of you are aware of C++ and Java and some of the other technical tools that have been around for quite some time. And actually, I should be quite bold about the fact that you should all know Java because it was invented here in Calgary. So hooray to us. We're everywhere in the world now, officially. But the blockchain platform itself is nothing more than just the next level, the next evolutionary level of some of these already existing technology platforms that are out there. So most of you will wonder, well, how do I get a blockchain specialist? Well, I wondered about that as well back last year in June when I was working with a global oil and gas company, and we were looking at how do we take the workflow process for management of tank assets, so those big 100,000 barrel tanks, and how do we take the API process and digitize it using this workflow of smart contracts, which we'll get to in a minute. And the reality was when I started looking for developers, I kept saying, hey, who's a blockchain developer? And I'd get like 50 hands up. And then I'd say, great, now how many of you can show me some work that you've done? And I would go down to 10. And then I'd say, great, now I want to see your credentials, that you actually know what you're doing. And funny enough, it'd always be kind of like one or two hands scattered in the corner. And even those were halfway up. So that's when we started digging a lot deeper into the technology and understanding that I can't take a guy that has some Java experience, some C or C++ experience, and help mold them into becoming a blockchain developer. What's important about the transition of blockchain technology is that in 2009, it came out as what we call private blockchain, which we'll talk about in a second here. And then what we saw in the evolution up to about 2015 is that people started figuring out that there's more to this technology, including the concept of applying it into what's called the private blockchain. How many of you remember the intranet inside your own companies, right? Yeah, you can put up your hands. You all have it. Because the intranet was really important to us, right? It was something that said, hey, I came into this company, I just got hired, so now somebody from IT has to give me access to have very permissioned information accessibility. And even when I was looking outside into the internet, I would only have certain web pages that I can ping and touch. So the concept of a private blockchain has been really around and retrofitted in a way that we've all been doing it for quite some time. It's just about the way that you set up the database structure to give you that need. But as we move forward, we started seeing that the real utility of private blockchain started kicking up in 2017 and late 2016, I should say, when IBM Hyperledger and the IBM Foundation came together and said, we would like to create a private blockchain platform that people can go out and use it and create this business-to-business transaction that's incredibly secure. So I know this is David's favorite slide, so I'm going to keep it up here for a little bit. But if we really look at the evolution of where we started from a database perspective, you started with having what's called a centralized database. And if you look at a centralized database, what's really critical about this is that it's got one single point of failure, which is that big black dot in the middle. So if somebody attacked that database and crashed it, everything around it was gone. There was no way to back up and any of that. We slowly moved into the decentralized environment, where we now have all these virtual servers and we have failovers and we have ways in which we can retrieve that information back and copy it back into our servers as if nothing ever happened, right? A lot of you are familiar because you typically have to ask your vendors, do you do load balance servers? Where are they hosted? Are they all in Canada? And so on and so forth. But then what we moved into the world of blockchain is this concept of a distributed database, which means that there is no single one point of failure. And the reason why this is important is because most of you might not know, but maybe about 4 weeks ago, a few of the key servers in the decentralized environment from YouTube crashed. Whoever thought that YouTube could be down? Like that's almost unprecedented. But it was down, and it was down for a good few hours. In an environment where the concept of distributed exists, where a distributed database exists, there's always a live, living copy of every single edit that gets made, or every single component that gets added. And it exists in one of the different nodes that you get to select in there. They're not randomized, you get to select them. But you get to say how often this gets synced up continuously. So why is this important? It's because if we really look back at what is blockchain and what is the new database model of blockchain, today in a typical database you can do 3 fundamental things. You can add, you can edit, and you can delete. Imagine a world where in a database model you can no longer action on the word delete. Imagine if it's a place that it's only append only, and every single touch to that database gets recorded in some sort of a transaction that everybody that's impacted by that transaction gets notified instantly. So why is that important? Recently we were working with a company that is a publicly traded company, and they went out to the market with their year-end press release with the information about their financials. And they had actually overestimated it by 10%. That's crazy. I mean, I literally just presented to the CPA conference a few weeks ago, and in the moment I said 10%, the accountants went, it was a big, like, deep gap. But what was really interesting about it is the fact that somebody in the report, as it was moving between the different people, fat-fingered something in that report that now enabled somebody to make a decision on that without realizing that somebody had fat-fingered it. And by the time it made itself public, and people realized, oh my God, I think somebody screwed up here somewhere, they had to go back and fix it. Well, imagine if there was an environment where anytime somebody made a change that could have impacted a public company and their records that they're about to submit publicly, if somebody would have been notified about that change and said, do you agree with this deletion or the re-adding of this information? Imagine if that happened instantaneously. I bet a lot of you today are sitting back and you're saying, okay, we're going into our year end right now, and we need to really ensure that all of our data is what we intend it to be. Imagine if there's a way for you to not have to worry about that on every year end or on every quarterly report that you have to do, because all the data, the way that it's being captured is the only way that it's being managed. And it's being managed by everybody that's impacted by that data set. It's revolutionary. It's a new way of looking at it. So the reason why I'm bringing this up and why I think it's really important is because today what you have are 2 different types of blockchains. And we talked earlier about possibly a 3rd type of blockchain, which is called a mixed blockchain that allows you to do both public and private, depending on how you set it up. But in a public blockchain, which is where the world of Bitcoins and cryptocurrency really, really thrives and lives today, there's one fundamental challenge that as businesses we can't really accept or adopt yet. And this is why the private blockchain has made its headways into this world. Because in a public blockchain, even though your information, meaning your user ID or named information, is publicly hidden, or the information within that block of transaction is publicly available. So, I mean, Jill and I talked about this from a perspective of an AER perspective, right? I mean, imagine if I'm sitting here and I'm saying, I don't want to show you my GHG emission on this specific well, but I'm going to hide the UWI. Well, who cares? I can go in and I can go back through the records and identify who owns that UWI immediately. And I already know it's Conoco. Conoco, I'm not picking them, just letting you know. So this is one of those examples, right, where you're saying, well, I don't want my information to truly be public about all my well data sets and so on and so forth. So really the fundamental concept of a private blockchain has started kicking in, which says, imagine if there was a way where I could give you permission to see the information that you need to see at that point in time and nothing else but that. So private blockchain really focuses on having a technology that's built in a, I allow you to do something that you only have the rights to do. So I want to talk a little bit about cryptocurrencies and ICOs. And first of all, I'm not giving you any ICO advice, but obviously if I could give you one, don't look at it right now. And if you own any, just hold on. Take a look at the Alberta Securities Commissions and some of the other groups because they're doing a great job bringing it out and talking about its value propositions, how you can manage them, how you should own your assets, how do you report them, and so on. But there's three different types really of tokens that exist out there. So because ICOs are typically related to public blockchain technology, you're going to see that there's two different kinds. There's a security token, a utility token, and recently you're going to start hearing more and more news about stable tokens. And if you want to identify what kind of cryptocurrency something is, you have to apply what's called a Howey Test. And the value of the Howey Test is that it really kind of goes back, if I can kind of blanket it at a 100,000 foot view level, it tells you, is this something that you look at generating a profit from? And if it is, you're most likely going to be a security. And if it's not, if it's intended to just be traded between people at no value on a platform, then it's a utility token. So if any of you have kids at home that play Xbox or PlayStation or other game consoles like that, where they say, hey, I want to buy some tokens because I want to buy some avatars or whatever it is, that's, in our case, if we were going to relate it back, it would be considered a utility token because it's something that cannot be extracted back into a financial gains or a value. And it cannot be sold for anything more than what it was already bought for. What you're going to see slowly is the push of utility tokens, stable tokens and stable coins. And those really focus on having them physically backed by something. So we've heard now a few times in the industry where people are looking to back things up with things like diamond reserves, with things like paintings, or the actual USD itself. So you can say, I as a bank, or I'm willing to support this specific token for, say, $100 million, which means there's 100 million coins that can be exchanged between people that only increases its value year over year at, say, 2%. So nothing significant enough for somebody to make a big buck out of. But let's get a little bit into the smart contract side of the business. Smart contracts are incredibly important because this is what you use when you set up private blockchain or business-to-business blockchain transactions. How many of you have done a Visio diagram or some sort of workflow diagram recently, or in the last little bit anyway? Okay, so think of a Visio diagram that says, this block is connected to this block, it's connected to this block, and then we have the if-then, so the yes-no. Imagine if each one of those individual blocks, if we could actually add code behind each one of them and create what we call an enforced workflow that walks you and everybody else that's involved in that workflow and says, only after you perform all the tasks that are enumerated here can you really move on to the next step, and move on to the next step, and move on to the next step. So the reason why that's really important is because today we're seeing information kind of flow throughout our organization, multiple touches on that transaction, multiple touches on that piece of information. What if there was a way for you to then say, you cannot go to the next phase unless all of us agree that everything has been completed the way we expect it to? So let's take a look at a little bit of the ecosystem. Now, I like the slide even more now than I did earlier this year when others in the room have seen me speak, because now officially this slide is 1 year old. And the reason why this is important is because a year ago, when people started kind of gathering the blockchain ecosystem and starting to put it into ways that we can understand it, we started seeing it kind of show up and say, hey, here's where we can apply it, here's how it's going to look, and here's who's doing what in what business frame. Well, this is what that slide ended up looking about 4 months later, in February of this year. And the reason why this was important is because all of a sudden you have companies that are worth in a valuation of $500 million plus that are starting to eat the food of some of the bigger players. So now you've got these people sitting back and saying, well, I don't have that kind of budget in my acquisition portfolio that I can go out and buy everybody that's starting to target my market. So what am I going to do? I have to let them either grow or expand or see where they can make themselves valuable into the ecosystem. We're putting together a slide right now that's gonna show the next evolution as we see it a year later. So we're gonna release that slide in mid-January. And I can tell you that already what we've done is we've had to partition this out in about 3 different slides because of the size of the market and how fast it's expanded. One of the things that makes blockchain so interesting as an open source technology is the fact that globally, 24/7, 365, there's a developer that can work on making it better or patching up areas that somebody identified as a gap in that technology. There is no technology company in the world today that has 24/7, 365 developers working for them doing this. You might be saying, well, actually, Dan, that might not be true. You got Infosys, you got all these guys. No, you don't. Because those people are forced to build something while the people that are actually patching it are doing it out of their own passion. And there's a big difference versus the guy that gets paid and the guy that's passionate about disrupting somebody or something. So keep that in mind, and that's something that's really important as to why you're seeing the evolution of these technologies in such a rapid amount of time, showing up at your doorstep saying, hey, actually, we might not have looked like production 6 months ago, but we're definitely ready for production today. So what's been really fun is when we started looking at the disruptors being disrupted. And obviously what I mean by that is you have groups like Google that were disruptors of the typical web browsers back in the Netscape days and Ask Jeeves and everybody else, if you remember those. But now you have them being disrupted by blockchain-enabled technology platforms like Brave. Brave is a web browser that completely removes every single ad that hits you. When I open up the National Post or any of these groups, I on average have to shut down right now about 45 different apps. Well, this is what Brave does officially for me now. And to most of you, if any of you really don't know why your cell phone bills keep going up, it's not actually because you're using more data than you ever did before. It's because you have so many of these different advertisements embedded into that news article that you wanted to read that it's sucking up actually all of your data. So you're not technically using more data than you ever did before. It's just there's now an inbound of information that you can't remove. So Brave has been doing a fantastic job at that. One of the other ones that's worth, and by the way, you can download it on your phone, you can download it on your laptop. It's something that's fairly straightforward and easy to use. The other one that's really neat is you're going to start seeing groups like the social network groups like Steemit starting to go out and impact the social media scene. Steemit right now has about 120 million global users. How many of you have heard of Steemit or have done a Steemit post? Oh, look at that. I've got like 3 people. Fantastic. To the rest of you, it's 120 million users that have been picked up over the last year of being in business. When we break down the blockchain market, we kind of break it down into 4 different segments. And the one that we say we always focus on is really that business to business, which is in blue, for our ecosystem. The reason why that's important is because, as you can see from IBM's presentation and slide, you're going to start realizing very quickly that this is where the ecosystem is starting to move towards. The part that's really shocking and kind of heartbreaking in a way is that, no, you don't see energy sector on here. And that's hard for me because I've grown up in this sector. I've built my last 2 tech companies in this sector. So for me, this is something that hits close to home. But the challenge is that a lot of the times we look at ourselves as fast seconds. I don't know about you, but when I wake up in the morning, I don't look at being a fast second to something. I look at how do I win today and what do I do to win today. So the challenge that we're seeing is they're seeing us as fast second or fast third adopters. When we looked at applying blockchain for the first time, we said, how do we eat our own cooking? Because fundamentally what we're starting to see is a lot of people going out and saying, I'm building blockchain products. We're seeing so much brochureware, so much slideware, and yes, slideware is officially a word now, where people coming in saying, here's all the pretty slides of something I would like to build. Please give me the money so I can build it. So now you're going to feel like a constant investor and venture capitalist every day of your life now. But the reason why we went out and started going down this path of build what you're talking about is because we realized very quickly a few things. As TerraHub, we remained what we call blockchain platform agnostic, meaning that we didn't pick a single winner to say, I'm going to support only IBM as a platform or Ethereum or Corda or any of the other major platforms. We looked at saying, how do we actually see what the fit for purpose is and what the need is of a client and tell them, here's the platform that could best fit the requirement that you have. So what we ended up doing is we ended up saying, okay, imagine if I'm now in field operations perspective and or I'm a driver for specific hauling a specific product between multiple parties. I now need to carry this nice book with me that says, here's all my certifications that say I'm allowed to be on that site and that I'm certified to do what I need to do. Imagine if there was a way for that driver to own his certifications in his own wallet, in his phone, and having that certification validated by that credentialing authority. But furthermore, imagine if he or she could now share that credential with that person they're going to go out on site to do some work for. Say they're going to go do some welding, or say they're going to go do some offsite work in a remote location. Imagine if that field operations manager knew who's going on that site, that they're certified, and how they reduce their HSE risk. So the reason why we applied blockchain behind the scenes for this is because we wanted to show that visibility, auditability, and this new trust model can now be all put together in a way in which every single party can benefit from it. So we developed our own product. And we did it in probably about 2.5 weeks. The reason why that's important is because you're going to be at a point now where you're going to start getting interested in blockchain technology. You're going to want to take a look and seeing how it applies in your business. But you're now going to have to put on your entrepreneurial hat on that says, I need to be able to develop and understand if this is a value proposition for me, kind of in a rapid prototype environment, 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. I cannot afford to spend months on end to see if this technology can be a value proposition to my business unit. Some of the emerging projects that are coming up in blockchain here in Calgary that are worth for you guys to know about. But before we go there, I'd like to point out that there's one major one that officially kicked off in production last month. And that is through a group called VAKT, V-A-K-T, out of Europe. And it was supported by Equinor, which is the old Statoil, for those of you that don't know the name change, BP, GP, and I want to say it was Exxon that was involved in it as well. But overall, was it Shell? Awesome. So Shell was a part of it as well. So the nice part about that is that it's the first trading platform for natural resources. And the reason why that's also important is because they are the first true to production-ready blockchain-enabled technology platform. But the one thing that I want to make clear is that there isn't such a thing as 100% blockchain-enabled platform. You still need a front-end developer, you still need back-end developers, you still need some of the resources that you've already been hiring and have in your shops. You just need to allow some of the other resources, such as the database modeling groups and so on, to understand how they can create their structure in a way in which it fits the blockchain enablement model. So please keep in mind that if somebody comes and says 100% blockchain, a front end on blockchain doesn't really exist. That stuff hasn't really been enabled yet. But let's not forget some of the other components that exist out there, which is for most of us that have had a chance to work with regulatory bodies, we're going to realize very quickly that the regulatory groups are hard to move and to understand always the value of the value proposition of a blockchain-enabled technology. But the only thing you can do is to go out and ensure that you educate them as to why you're making this happen, how you're applying it, and ask them to come on board and work with you in some of these small proof of concepts, so everybody takes kind of a small bite of the big elephant. Because the last thing you want to do is go out and build something for yourself and then realize that, well, actually, I can't get my regulatory approval. And the reason why I put up the first one up here, which is the SOX compliance for fintech, is because we actually did this. So we built this product last year in June for a publicly traded company that gets audited by one of the big four. And guess what happened to us? We enabled the back end of that technology to have blockchain added to it. And the big four came in and said, sorry, I can't audit that smart contract because I don't know how to audit a smart contract. So we had to now go back and say, okay, well, let us now train some of your guys internally to understand how to audit a smart contract. So then you can go in and give them approval for this, because as a publicly traded company, they can't post their numbers without the SSA 18 approval. So remember that this is a multi-party game where you now need to ensure that the third parties that you work with, in this case the auditing firms, are also enabled and understand how to put their stamp of approval on what you're doing. So when we're saying work as a team, we really mean understand all of the actors in that business case, understand who is enabled to be there. And this is why a lot of times we're looking at blockchain as a bolt-on technology to existing platforms. Right, so last year when I was working with one of the majors, we were actually using SAP Preventive Maintenance to look at the big tank asset maintenance program. And we realized very quickly that there's no way for us to go in and do a direct replacement of that SAP model, but we could bolt on the technology to it to give them the ability to now have a blockchain-enabled workflow. Which means that all the way up to here, you would work in your current system, you'd push outside through a web interface, continue down the process in a blockchain-enabled product, and then move back into the financial system, and now everything is still auditable. So there's many different ways of doing it. You just have to understand how and why you want to apply blockchain. And we will be the first ones to say not everything should be applied in a blockchain technology. New jobs are evolving out of this. So don't think that blockchain is coming in and it's going to steal people's jobs. The way that I like to say it is, think about all the jobs that have been lost already and how many new hats you all have to wear because of the people that have been let go. The business still has to continue. So there has to be an opportunity in which you can take that and say, hey, if I can take out a process that's maybe a mundane process, if I can remove that from my workflow, how can I do it using blockchain? I mentioned to you earlier that I have 3 favorite slides. This is my second favorite slide. And the reason why this slide is really fun for me is because this little girl is kind of 8 to 10 years old right now. In the next 10 years, she's going to university. And a few years afterwards, she's going to come knocking on your door for a job. Look who she's interacting with. The reason why this is important is because she is already technologically enabled and is expecting a certain kind of technology advancement from you to provide them into her day-to-day life and what she's going to perform as a job for you. So you now have to figure out over the next 10 years, and I know some of you are going to put up your hand and say, oh, I'm retiring in 10 years. No, you're not. Life expectancy has gone up, so sorry to burst your bubble. So this means that we have to figure out a way in which we can enable some of these new upcoming individuals into our lives and welcome them with open arms by getting them the technology that they need to best perform in what they're doing. We eat our own cooking. So we talk about the fact that when you look at a blockchain project, what should you do? Well, first of all, educate yourselves and work with people that can walk you through what is blockchain, what's private, what's public, how does it enable you to become more efficient in what you do. Take a day to understand and do the workflow mapping, to understand who are all the actors, what are the different business units, what are the different third-party service providers that you need to bring to the table. And then go out and do rapid prototyping, 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out. And then the ones that you find that actually have the value proposition you expect it to have and the KPIs you want it to, go ahead and start doing quick 3-month, bring it to a proof of concept, and allow yourself to now move forward. And this is my last and final favorite slide, so it's my third slide, which is the leap of trust. And I like to ask this question because typically when you look at the first credit card transaction you've ever done online, the scariest part about that transaction was when the system asked you for that, the 3 letters or the 3 numbers on the back. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, you now officially have all the information about me. How do I know that you're not going to steal it and do another transaction? But the bigger question is, how many of you here use Uber or soon to be Lyft? Yeah, okay. So the funnest part about this is that you obviously love getting into the car with strangers. Your parents grew up telling you, don't open up the door to strangers, but this is what you do, right? You fundamentally trust an app that it says this guy's got a 4.93 rating. His name is Bob. He's coming with a Honda Civic, which is blue, and you should trust getting into the car with Bob. Well, all that you've done is you've enabled the technology companies to create this new trust model for you to say, it's okay to get in the car with Bob because he's going to be okay and he's going to be a nice guy. And by the way, he's an expert navigator. And that's the same thing with your blockchain proof of concept. It's the same thing with you applying artificial intelligence or machine learning to your organization. It shouldn't be scary. It should be taken in one small step at a time, and you need to understand how and why you want to apply it and where do you want to apply it. So really, when you look at this technology, don't look at it as something that, oh, it's going to come in time. I can tell you right now that in the US, the companies that I get to work with in the US, which are some of the global super majors, they're so far ahead of what we're doing here in Alberta, it's incredibly scary. And the reason why it's scary is because I'm now going down at the end of January and training about 35 developers that are actually developers from the big oil and gas companies that are saying, we want to know how to write smart contracts. We want to know that when we hired IBM to build a project for us, we can now go in and audit those smart contracts in what they've done for us. I have yet to train a single blockchain or enable a single blockchain developer in Calgary. That should tell you something, because they're going to take now the next level of competitive advantage when they start doing things like one-touch invoicing. They've now reduced some of their new overhead and some of the mundane tasks that take people away from doing what they really got hired for to do. In closing, thank you for having me here today. I'm going to be around here for a little while, but right now we're going to go into a Q&A session. So please ask away. And by the way, the one thing is there's no bad questions in blockchain.
Dan, if we've got a company that is importing a product and right now using letters of credit, then that company needs inventory financing, dealer financing, and then financing for the end user as in retail financing. Do you see blockchain as being something that will be of value to this type of business model?
The answer is going to be yes, but I don't know if blockchain is today at the level that you need it to help you actually go through the entire backend component of what you're actually offering as a service. So the reality is that the blockchain technology as it stands today, it still has a lot more evolution to do before it gets to a truly full production ready to be rolled out product. So what you could do today is you can take a look at blockchain and see how I can augment parts of my existing workflow in adding this part of the process to it. But really what it's going to do for you, it's going to follow the principle of what's called liquid assets and liquid talent that's now available, and it's talked about more and more in the blockchain ecosystem. So what you're doing is you're enabling this liquid assets component that says we now all have visibility and transparency into how we're going to perform this job from end to end, and all the different parties that are involved in it can now see where the product is at some point in time. In the concept of liquid assets, what's going on is saying, imagine if I have a barge of, say, crude that's somewhere out at sea heading its way towards the delivery port. Imagine if I could now enable to say that that is valued at X, so therefore I could use that dollar value as leverage to go and make my next purchase. So if you want to take a look at something, I'll take a look at a process called liquid assets.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question about energy consumption. So, for example, Bitcoin mining, it's well known that it consumes a lot of electricity with, for example, the new Bitcoin mine in Medicine Hat. Yep. Is it similar for all technologies relying on blockchain technology, that they are all big users of electricity?
Thank you. That's a very good question, actually. So,
and Dan, can you explain what Bitcoin mining is first?
Okay, sounds good. So today in the public network, we talked about the public blockchain and private blockchain. In the public blockchain network, in order for you to have a transaction validated, you do what's called mining. And mining is really a way in which you get paid for resolving a very high valued equation or very, let's say, how would you say the right word for that is? It's a very long algorithm that you have to solve. So in order for you to get paid the bounty, that's also known as gas in the mining world, you have to solve this very complex equation. And it's always the first person that solves it that gets paid the bounty for that transaction. So as an example, if I say, David, I really like your watch. Do you like my watch? I'd like to exchange watches. We now have to go to a third party that neither one of us knows or was able to buy off and say, please validate that I have the asset that I say I have. Please validate that David has the asset he says he has. And now through your validation, we trust that we're now willing to pay you. And it's typically the person that initiates the process that puts up the bounty. So I'm saying I'm willing to pay you $10 in evaluation of crypto for you to validate that the transaction is valid. So that's what mining is. The problem is that back in 2009, when the first crypto Bitcoin was actually mined, somebody could physically do that mathematical equation by hand. Every single time a new Bitcoin gets mined, or a new series of Bitcoins get mined, that encryption itself keeps going higher. So what that means is that the equation itself gets a lot harder to solve. So now what that means, fundamentally, is that you now need these bigger machines and computing power to be able to solve the equation the fastest in order for you to receive that monetary value out of it, that bounty. So to your point of, or to your question of mining cryptocurrencies and the GHG emissions associated to it and so on and so forth, remember one thing, if you can walk away from today, is in a private blockchain, which is a business to business, cryptocurrency and mining does not exist because we, the people that are involved in that transaction, are also the consensus. It's up to us to agree who is now next in line to perform the next job. It's only in the public blockchain environment where you actually have to have a third-party consensus, and that's where the cryptocurrency comes in. So to the business side for B2B, please keep in mind that you do not have GHG consumption to your company because you're not actually validating or doing any transactions on a public network.
I'll just add that there is a big environmental footprint now associated with Bitcoin mining and energy use.
So what can be done to interface different types of blockchain technologies?
Awesome. We just talked about that actually earlier today in a quick interview. So there's new blockchain platforms that become interoperability platforms. So for example, out of Toronto, you've got one of the ones that's coming up called MaveNet through the ION group, AION. And that's what they do. They work on interoperability platforms. So they say, if you wrote a smart contract in Ethereum and I wrote a smart contract in Hyperledger Fabric and somebody else wrote it in Corda, how do we ensure that we can actually translate that together? The best way for you to think about it in our world of EMP is the JIB of that ecosystem. So there are a lot of new middleware or interoperability platforms that are starting to come up because we are realizing that is a problem or will be a problem in the future.
When you talk about picking up your first Uber ride or online credit card transaction, it's a personal choice to make that. What do you think is stopping companies, especially energy companies, to make that leap of trust? Because it's very competitive in Calgary. What do you think will change that?
I think that's a very good question. What's going to change that is looking at innovation and having an innovation budget that doesn't just sound like I need to buy a new server. So keep in mind that the challenge is if you don't know what you're buying, but you have somebody constantly knocking on your door saying, buy this because it's going to be good for you, but you don't really understand it, how can you really make a purchasing decision, right? So a lot of the times what we're seeing is there's been a lot of hype around blockchain. There's been a lot of the ups and downs of the blockchain world, but it's really hard to go out and educate an entire team to say, this is why you want to do this. Here's the value proposition, and here's how much it should actually cost you. Like when I look at some of our proof of concepts that we've done, we're talking about 30 grand, right? Like I'm not talking about $1 million, $2 million, $5 million for you to then see if you succeed or fail, right? So that's why when I say go back to being an entrepreneur and go back to understanding how do I succeed quickly or fail and learn quicker, that's where you should be. It should be in those kind of quick, rapid prototyping environments. So I hope that one day this whole emerging tech has to be expensive kind of gets and goes away because it doesn't have to be expensive.